My name is Roger de Robillard. I was born in Mauritius, but I've been in Australia since I was 13. I've been involved in the Australia-Africa space since about 1986. I was a founding member of the Australia-Africa Business Council and have been the president for New South Wales for the last 5 years. I'm also the representative of the Mauritius Board of Investment in Australia on an honorary basis. Yeah, that's interesting. Back in 1986, no one was, well, it was hard to find anyone really interested in the space. There has been a major change over the last 5 years especially. And now there's a great deal of activity, especially in the mining field. But I'm not myself personally interested in the mining field. I'm more interested in the sustainable development, education, and financial business, which is possible between Australia and Africa. Well, I think now that some people think they can make a lot of money in that space. We now have dominance of the space by a very closed club, and that I see is a problem. Recently, for instance, the government of Australia through DFAT have named people, for instance, on a body called AGAR, which is supposed to be there as an advisory body to the Australian government for Australia-Africa relations. But how these people were chosen is quite murky. We don't know why these people were chosen. But it is remarkable that on that body there are very few members who are actually members of the African diaspora. There was no guideline, there was no request for anyone to apply to become a member. So how they were chosen, we don't know. But the fact that the president of AGAR is Mr. Peter Coleman, who is the head of Woodside, an oil and gas company that has a very, very poor history in East Timor, in exploiting East Timor, and which is now the subject of cases in The Hague. I mean, to me, that doesn't really show a great regard for putting African interests up front. Mm-hmm. So it's clear to me that when one looks at the membership of AGAR, that it is basically about people who have made money or who are interested in making money out of Africa. But whether it's a two-way process or not is a question mark. What I can say about AGAR is that I have tried, but it's extremely hard to connect with the members, and there's no communications channel as yet between AGAR and members involved in the Australia-Africa space. And in fact, the number of meetings and genuine exchanges between AGAR and the African heads of mission have been very few and far between. From what I understand, when there was a first meeting, the deputy chair of AGAR simply handed to the African High Commissioners and heads of mission their document of what they believed the agenda should be. So in other words, the agenda was not worked out by prior consultation with the heads of missions of Africa. It was what AGAR thought should be the agenda, and that was simply handed to them at the last Africa Day ceremony in Canberra. Well, yes, and thank you for raising that point, because that's one point I've been making for quite a long time. One good example is a very wonderful program, which is the Australia Awards and the Australia Alumni. This is a program whereby African students are brought to Australia to study. For so many years. They do master's and bachelor's degrees in top Australian universities. But what I have noticed is that it's a one-way business where the Africans are brought into Australia to learn the Australian way and to go back, and then they are used as ambassadors to promote Australia to Africans. But what I have seen is that the big problem in Australia is that Australians do not appreciate what Africans can really bring to Australia. The way the system is, it seems to be that Australians believe they're doing good for Africa and therefore they're good people. But I believe Australia is missing out on a lot of opportunities by not looking at what Africans can do for Australia. I think it's important that Australians appreciate what Africans can bring to Australia. For instance, Mr. Ma, M.A., who's a Chinese person who launched Alibaba, which is now just about the biggest trading platform in the world. And he said that the way he became aware of Australia is because as a child, he hung around an international hotel in his town, and he got to speak to an Australian child his age because he was just hanging around to learn English. And through that relationship where they kept talking to each other by mail, after having been rejected 7 times to come to Australia as a visitor, 7 times, eventually the family invited him and he came to Australia, and he said the fact he came to Australia changed his life. And that's what gave him the idea of eventually doing Alibaba, etc. But what I'm saying is, but what we see now is that Australia is benefiting a lot from Chinese people who've come here and who've done well in China. The person who was the most successful developer of solar panels in the world was a Chinese person who came to Australia, learned his skills here, then went back to China and got it manufactured there, but it was an Australian company that was making money in Australia. So that's what I think we have to, once we get Australians to understand that, then there will be a movement for Australians to urge their politicians to spend more money with Africans and to give Africans and Australians better access to the 2 countries. Well, that also is something I've been arguing about for the last 5 years. Australian company practice is accepted that the more diverse a board, the better. There are in excess of 220 listed companies from Australia that are actively involved in mining in Africa. And yet there are very few African people on those boards. And I have raised that issue with the Australian Institute of Company Directors. They have a mentoring program whereby they allow people to spend time with their top directors to learn the skills, but that's reserved for women and Aborigines. When I've said, well, can we have similar facilities for Africans, especially in Perth, where a lot of mining companies are based? The answer was, no, we're too busy giving courses in China, Hong Kong and Singapore, and we do not have the resources to provide this sort of assistance to Africans. Well, I think the way forward is we need to make Africa more of a talking point within the Australian society and within Australian politics. We need to change the Australian perception of Africans being people who live in basket case countries that are not democratic and which simply need assistance. We need to make Australians understand that they are being left behind, way behind in the global market. Because over the last 2 years, the United States of America, France, China, India have all had several meetings, both in their capital cities and in Africa, where they've called together all of the African heads of mission to talk about how they can invest in Africa. And when Australia is talking about security and thinking that, well, you send warships and you send soldiers and that's how you guarantee security, well, what the Americans are doing, what the French are doing, is they're creating their own security by getting their big companies to invest in Africa and to uplift the whole African population. But there's also a very simple thing. There's so much money now being invested in Africa by the United States. For instance, GE, the American company, they're investing more than $1 billion in Africa. So my point is that there's so much money being invested now by foreign powers into Africa that Australians, because we've got such specified skills and we're so good at what we do, we should be there and ride on the wave of investments. So we don't even have to bring in a lot of money. We have the skills. The tide is rising. The waves are being created by everyone else. What we have to do is just be there and ride the wave as champion surfers that we are. Well, obviously, I think the African diaspora, including myself, we all need to do better, because if there's a problem, I believe it's not just one party responsible, there's many parties responsible. Now, I've been trying to work with leaders of the African diaspora in various places. And I sense the last couple of years that there is at last a move for the African diaspora to look for issues that unite them and for which they can work together, as opposed to deciding they can't work together because of issues that divide them. So I think that's a very major impact that we can have, and more the African diaspora are starting to understand that united, they can then speak with a voice to the politicians and then achieve things that unite them and which are important to them. I should say thank you, Clyde, for giving me this opportunity, and I hope you're going to have similar interviews with many more people and try to fill the gap there is in this space. It seems to me one person we have who's a champion of the African cause in this space and who has all the good ideas is Matthew Newhouse, who's the head of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He's only just arrived in the post about a year ago, and I think he's already making a huge difference. So I would urge people, if they have good ideas, to talk to Matthew. That's one thing. And Matthew, I should say, grew up in Africa, knows Africa, speaks Swahili, he's a patron of the Great Lakes region, etc., etc. So that's one. Two, I believe that under Matthew's leadership, things are starting to improve, but what we need to do is, as I've said, to get the African diaspora themselves to start being proud of what they're achieving in Australia. One of the things I've suggested, for instance, is that we have 22 African professors working in Australia who are now Australians. Now, these are the sorts of people, and the lawyers, the accountants, who should be now leading the way and showing to Australians that they're just like everyone else and they can contribute to Australian society. One of the things I thought we should be doing, and the Australia-Africa Business Council is going to be doing it, is to have a readily available list of experts on Africa who are Africans and who understand the country, so that when the media starts reporting about the latest coup or the latest whatever they want to publicize in Africa, they would then have a readily available list of experts who can actually try to explain properly what's going on in Africa, instead of the Australian media simply regurgitating what the Murdoch press is saying in England or somewhere else. And to that effect, I think what you're doing is very important, because we also need to source information from non-English speaking sources, such as French and Portuguese and Spanish, because if one reads French newspapers about Africa, one has a totally different view of what's happening in Africa. You never see headlines about what happened in Senegal, where there's been a very smooth changeover of presidents. The same thing in many other countries, Senegal, Tanzania, etc. All you hear about are the one or two cases where there's a problem. And even to that effect, I think what the media ought to understand is that the Africans themselves now has their group of African leaders who get together and sort these issues. They have their own African way of sorting it, and they get the heads of state and the older members with the wisdom of past prime ministerships or presidents to get together and sort it out in an African way. I mean, the other thing that's very, very interesting is Rwanda is one of the most repressive countries where you can go, and it's totally a military state. There's a total lack of freedom. The last person who ran for president against Kagame is still in jail, and yet the media says not one word about it, and the British, the Australians, everyone spends a lot of money helping Rwanda. So there is this disjuncture in Australian policy where they claim to be champions of democracy, and yet they provide a lot of assistance to countries like Rwanda or Myanmar when they were totally anti-democratic. So you go and figure how the Australian policy works.